I made an Elite 100 list, the top 100 most impactful players in the NBA. Where do the Nuggets rank? We'll talk about that. I've got some wild West trade possibilities for you of what's like the most outlandish scenarios that I could actually see happening in the Western Conference this season. And I want to talk a little bit about what's the best and worst part of covering a team like the Nuggets. All that and more on Locked On Nuggets.
You are Locked On Nuggets, your daily Denver Nuggets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Nuggets, your daily Denver Nuggets podcast, part of the Locked On Network, your team every day. Thanks for joining us and making us part of your day. Appreciate you guys being with us on a Friday and joining us on whatever platform that you've chosen, whether you're on YouTube. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button if you are. Make sure to check it out if you're not. Or if you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts, give us those 5-star reviews. Or if you're on Getcasts or Pocket Casts or Spotify, we're on all these platforms. You can listen to us anywhere. We appreciate you making us part of your day. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. My name is Matt Moore. I'm the senior NBA writer for the Action Network, joining you on a Friday. Appreciate you guys being with us. No friend of the show Friday this week. My guest this week is not going to be available for a little bit, and you can probably piece those things together for a number of reasons, keeping new projects on the down low, etc. So I had to pivot, and that's okay. Friend of the show Friday will return next week. I already got a name in mind. On today's show, though, we're going to talk about I released an Elite 100 list over at Action Network. And has made lots of the internet mad at me again, as I want to do. We'll talk about the Nuggets spots on those, why I put them where I did, the difficulty in ranking them. We're going to talk about some wild trade possibilities in the Western Conference, because there are some things I think could happen in season that could really shake things up. We have some moving parts that I want to kind of clue you in on, as far as not things I'm reporting, but things that I could definitely see happening. And third segment, I want to talk a little bit about the best and worst parts of coverage. I get a lot of questions about what it's like covering the NBA and covering the Nuggets. So I thought we kind of get into what are the best and worst parts of my job covering the team on a daily basis, as well as the NBA. We'll talk about that overall. Let's start today by talking about the Elite 100. So back at CBS, when I worked at CBS Sports for years and years, we started doing a top 100 list. There was ESPN's version, and we were just like, yeah, sure, we'll do one too, because you get different voices and different kind of concepts. And at Action Network, I'm the primary NBA writer, and so it's a solo project of mine. And I've done it and not done it the last couple of years, depending on how I feel. My editor requested that I do it this year, so I was happy to do it. It's a great exercise, I think, for establishing value and understanding like the greater context of the league. And my premise essentially was who impacts winning the most, because that's always what I care about. That's how I judge MVP, is who impacts winning the most. Not Joel Embiid. Just get that out of the way. So as we're kind of to evaluate those things, I playoff performance, availability is a big thing. You got to be able to play in a lot of the games. You got to be available for your team to help them. Role is obviously a big deal. You get more points if you're the primary engine, primary ball handler, but if you don't do it efficiently, then you take a little bit of a hit. Now, I may have knocked LaMelo Ball a little too much when I put him 87, and everyone thinks I'm insane, which, hey, you live, you learn. But I want to talk more about the Nuggets, since this is Nuggets show today. It will not surprise you that, as he will be up pretty much unanimously, I can't imagine a list not having him number one. Nikola Jokic is number one on my Elite 100 list. Jokic ticks all the boxes, right? He's available if he needs to be. He would have played more games last season if it was called for. He's obviously the best player in basketball. He's just won finals MVP. His game translates to the playoffs. Remember when that was a talking point? Let's see how he plays in the playoffs. God, that was funny. Obviously dominant statistically, best in EPM, all these metrics that I really value. He's number one in. He ticks every single box. He's efficient. He's smart. All of his play is built towards making his team the best that it can be. A big deal for me, if you're the primary engine of a team, is do you make your teammates better? That's a big deal to me, because it's one of the things that's frustrated me about some of these MVP awards, and I'm not going to just harp on Embiid. He's part of a larger problem, which is just that, to be quite frank, it should be about, do you make your teammates better? Nikola dragged a team missing 2 starters to the playoffs, like got them out of the play-in and into the playoffs. That's extremely difficult to do. And I don't think that enough credit is given to guys that make their teammates better. And all 4 of the Nuggets that I have in the top 100, well, 3 of the 4, I would say, make their teammates better. And that was a big impact in where I wound up slotting these guys. So Nikola, number 1, no one's going to have a problem with. That seems pretty obvious, 1, and then obviously good for Nuggets fans. The questions are going to start obviously with Jamal Murray, who I have at 26. I had him in the 30s originally and moved him to 26. For a little bit of perspective, and again, you can check all this out over at actionnetwork.com or in the Action Network app. Right behind Anthony Edwards is where Jamal Murray is, because Anthony Edwards is pretty much the primary engine of the team at this point. He's their best player. The ball goes through him the most. Paul George is 24. So Jamal's on that tier. There's a tier of guys. I talked about this on the podcast with Ryan Blackburn. The way I do this is I rank all the players 1 to 5, with 1 being worst and 5 being best. And then you rank all of the 5s 1 through 5, with all of the fives being the best of the 5s and so forth. And you do that until you get enough separation out. Jamal's on a tier just at the base level with Paul George, Anthony Edwards, Domantas Sabonis, Kristaps Porzingis, who a lot of people were surprised that I had as high as I did at 27. He was insane 28 rather. He was insane last year. Go look at his numbers. He played in all the games. He was great. He'll go down this season, but where KP was last season, I got to give him credit. Drew, and that's it. Drew Holiday's in the next tier down. So he's better than Drew Holiday on this list. He's better than Trae Young on this list. There's a lot of, obviously, I think, pressure from being somebody that covers the team to have Jamal higher. I did a playoff ranking and Jamal is he's top, I think he's 11th, and that's for a guy that's second, that's not the primary ball handler Jokic is. So if Jamal were asked to, do I think he could? Probably. And maybe it would help him, but maybe the efficiency would suffer. Jamal's obviously an elite playoff player. The next step for him, if he wants to be top 20, if he wants to be a top 15, if he wants to be a top 10 player in this league, you got to do it in the regular season. And I do want to stress this, that they're not excuses. Okay. The injuries are legitimate. Okay. He was young before the 2020 bubble. And then he had the breakout in 2020. And maybe with a regular schedule after the bubble, he comes in the next season off of full rest and dominates. But he didn't. He was on short rest. And then he was okay in the beginning, started to pick it up, was going to be an all-star. And then he didn't. And then he got hurt. Missed the entire next season. These aren't excuses. They're reasons. But I'm very big on this. You can't get credit for things you haven't done. And so, even baseline level, there's a lot of conversation. Darius Garland's been an all-star. Why isn't he higher? And the reality is, I punished Garland a lot. I polished all the Cavs for how that first-round playoff series went. I made a decision to punish those guys. They were favored in a playoff series, and they completely melted. That's going to hurt your rankings pretty significantly. Jamal, I think getting through the season and playing as many games as he did last season was impressive. Being as fresh and as healthy and playing as many minutes in the playoffs, same kind of thing. But if he's going to be any higher, if he's going to be higher than 25, he's going to be one of the 25 best players in the league. Or, if you want him to be a top 2 player on one of these teams, right? Or a top 15 rather in this league, he's going to have to be an all-star next season. He's going to have to play that level, at least where I think he's an all-star, where it's he is that good. And he hasn't done that yet. So until he kind of gets there, I don't necessarily think that this ranking is off in any regard. It gives him a lot of credit for the playoff performance. If it wasn't for the playoff run, if we were just judging this off a regular season, Jamal would be 30s or 40s. That's just the reality of where he is, because availability, understandable due to the injury, some inconsistency game to game. He developed a lot in terms of playmaking. Got to see it for another season and all those types of things. Somebody asked where he was amongst these guys. So these are level 5 guys in the bottom of the 5. So they're 5-1s. He is 3rd on that list. It's Paul George, Anthony Edwards, and then Jamal. That's where he ranks amongst those guys on that tier. So that's kind of where he winds up. Third player I want to talk about, obviously, you got to talk about AG. I have Aaron. I was surprised there was some conversation that MPJ would be higher. That's insane to me. That's not, I can't believe you can get there. I feel like Aaron's probably a little bit too low, to be quite honest with you, but I could not get him any higher. He's at 46. And the best way I can kind of think to compare him is I have Aaron as essentially the best role player in the league. If you look at the guys that are above him, and he's the best player amongst what are the 4-4-4s, right? So not 5s, a 4, not 4-5s, a 4-4, right? If you look at the guys that are ahead of him, though, Brook Lopez, who was runner-up to Defensive Player of the Year was able to actually take over post scoring when called upon last season. Like I went back and forth on whether AG should be in that group or not. Julius Randle was 44. And if you ask me who I'd rather have, Aaron Gordon or Julius Randle, I'd rather have Aaron Gordon. But Julius is essentially either a number 1 or number 2 on a team that made the second round of the playoffs, and he was all NBA. I have quibbles with Julius's game. I've liked it since he was at Kentucky, but there are issues with Julius's game, and in a playoff series, no doubt I'd rather have Aaron. But the usage does matter here, and Julius does put like production. I have to always balance myself from just caring about impact and also realize that production is impact. And Julius does get a higher usage and is productive with it, and so he gets to be higher than that. Fred VanVleet's up there. Van Vliet is honestly a much more closer to elite player than you would think he is in terms of efficiency, assist rate. There's been several seasons when he's been top 5 in both 3-pointers made and assists. That's hard to do. And so Fred VanVleet, I think, is a little underrated. You got guys like Desmond Bane, Zach LaVine, Mikal Bridges. These are all like number 1 guys on their team or number 2 options. Aaron right now is a number 3, and the number 3 job that he does is extremely important. And I think he's the best number 3 maybe in the NBA. And I'll include Phoenix in that category. I'll include Golden State in that territory, honestly, with where Klay Thompson's at. Like, Aaron Gordon's probably the best number 3 in that range. Zamora asked, do you think AG could ever be in Defensive Player of the Year conversation? Probably not. Just given that he's not going to have, you have to understand blocks really do count a lot. You have to have some level of like measurable impact that people can get to. It's hard otherwise. And otherwise he'd have to be Kawhi level. And I'm not sure that there's a way for him to be able to do that, especially given he does have a pretty big offensive role. You know, he's not a specialist like some defensive players are. So I think that really matters in this context. Finally, Michael Porter Jr., who I have way further down on the list. Understandably, Ryan Blackburn, who always likes young players, had an MPJ much higher. I have him 74. And if you're wondering like where he sits here, he's in a tier with Scotty Barnes, who's, you know, arguably the best player on the Raptors. Tyrese Maxey, right? Superstar kind of waiting. Kyle Kuzma, who I think is really underrated. He's really good. Marcus Smart, who I think is a player that really helps impact winning. Andrew Wiggins, who is like he seriously helps the Warriors as a title guy. Malcolm Brogdon, reigning 6th man of the year, and then MPJ. Other guys in this tier include Emmanuel Quickley, Jeremy Grant is 2 spots below MPJ, Chris Paul, Josh Giddey, and a few others. So there's the thing with MPJ is largely that I think MPJ is really great at his role, and he's really crucial to the Nuggets. The Nuggets have asked him to be something very particular, which is effectively a 3-and-D guy. They don't run offense through him. He's not the primary initiator. He's not an engine. He is an absolutely devastating shooter. Part of the problem is that there's just a lot of guys that shoot 40 to 42% in the NBA now. That used to be like an exceptional skill, and now that's not the standard. 38%, I would say, is like the standard. But he's always well above that. 3 percentage points is a lot. It's that MPJ didn't shoot like 44%. Had he shot like 44%, like everyone thinks that I'm included in that, thinks he's capable of, he probably comes in 15 spots higher. But when shooting is that important, the gap between an outlier crazy ass 44% and 41% is pretty significant. The rebounding for MPJ is a big part of why he lands on this list. What he showed in the playoffs in terms of being a guy that can help defensively, not just not be a liability, but actually help, then he's on this list as well. Villainy says MPJ, when healthy, clearly top 50. I don't know, man, because a lot of the top 50 guys are either primary engines or they are elite at one specific regard. And you could say that MPJ is an elite shooter, and that's probably accurate. But I would say that you need to have a better balance of the other things in order for me to be able to get there. Can MPJ get there? For sure. A lot of the problem with this list is that you're limited by what your team allows you to do. And that was a large part of it with MPJ. All right, that's gonna wrap it up for my conversation on the Elite 100. You can check it out and my like blurbs about everybody over there at Action Network, actionnetwork.com. It's on my timeline as well. So you can check that out as well. On the other side, I want to talk about some wild trade possibilities in the Western Conference, because there's a handful of moves that I've got my eye on and teams that I really want to see what happens with them. We'll talk about how the West could look a lot different by the trade deadline rather than it looks right now. We'll talk about that on the other side. First, I can tell you about FanDuel Sportsbook. Football season's about to kick off, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to win all season long. Right now, when you bet on a Super Bowl winner, you can get bonus bets every time they win in the regular season. I took the Bengals under this bet. I used this bonus, and I took the Cincinnati Bengals, who I think are going to win 13 games. I think they're going to be in the AFC Championship game. I think they're better than the Bills. I think they're the second best team to the Chiefs. Chiefs have a Super Bowl hangover, so the Bengals are my best bet on that. You pick any team to win the Super Bowl, and you'll get bonus bets for every victory that you can use on spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. I'm sorry to tell you, I'm going to take the under on the Broncos again. I'm not excited about it. I'm less excited about it than I have been recently. The injuries, you guys have had a pretty rough training camp with all the injuries. Judy was the lightest one. There's a lot of injuries on that Broncos team for a roster that I think is probably still a little overrated as it typically is. So sadly, I'm on the under again, but I think this one I'm going way lighter on. I'm not as confident as I have been in recent years. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon if you want to go against me and bet that over on the Broncos 8.5. Start earning bonus bets with America's #1 sportsbook. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. We're also brought to you today by Ibotta. Picking up burgers and hot dogs for a summer barbecue, you're already doing it. So why not get cash back while you're doing it with Ibotta? They give you cash back on hundreds of grocery store items, from produce to personal care to pantry goods, so you can make sure you're beating inflation no matter where you're purchasing. Either link your loyalty account or upload your receipt to Ibotta after you shop and get your cash back. It's just that easy. The average Ibotta user earns $120 per year. That could cover the cost of an entire shopping trip. Or you could use your cash back to buy that flight you've been eyeing. Other apps give you points that you don't amount to much, but with Ibotta, you get real cash that you can cash out to your bank account, PayPal, or gift cards if you want to spread the wealth. You can earn cash back on hundreds of online brands and retailers too when you start with Ibotta, including Lowe's, Macy's, Sephora, Best Buy, and more. Right now, Ibotta is offering our listeners $5 just for trying Ibotta by using the code LOCKED, LOCKED, when you register. Just go to the App Store or Google Play and download the free Ibotta app and use code LOCKED. That's Ibotta, IBOTTA, in the Google Play or App Store, and use code LOCKED. We'll be right back on Locked On Nuggets. Back here on Locked On Nuggets, thanks for joining us and making us part of your day. Appreciate you guys being with us. Zamora is getting here spoiling part of my conversation. He says, I heard an interesting proposal the other day I like. Joel Embiid to Portland for Scoot, Sharp, Nurk, and picks. I know Dame wants out, but I think that's as good a package as Philly could get. So I think if Harden goes elsewhere and Embiid asks out, it's not like a crazy idea. It would be a pretty wild one. I will say, I'm very interested in the idea of Embiid and Dame teaming up. And the reason I say that is I heard, going back, this is like November, I heard Dame would really like to play with Joel, and the feeling is mutual. And now a lot of guys would like to play together. A lot of guys would play together. Cat and Booker would love to play together. So there's all these combinations, right? If we look at that, and we kind of go down this kind of pathway. Miami, would they give up Bam in a Joel Embiid package? Probably, and that's a better asset than they're going to get back from probably anywhere else. If Dame were to open it up and be like, well, I'll go somewhere else if Embiid's going to be there too. I think New York probably says no because of the connections with Brunson, but it'd be a really interesting question, right? If you can get Joel Embiid and Damian Lillard, do you just bail on the whole Jalen Brunson thing, right? If Embiid says, I'll come to New York, but I only want to play with Dame, do you start throwing out, you could deplete yourself, and Dolan would probably do it. A lot of this is you're always we look at teams in these conversations, and a lot of time what you should look at is ownership. Is ownership willing to spend? Is ownership willing to put them at risk of tanking years down the line? That's a lot of this. Miami's always kind of been we'll risk it. If we have to suffer for a year, fine. But we want to stay in contention as much and constantly as always. So I think when this happens, or not when this happens, but when we have these conversations, I think it's important to kind of remember the owners. And Dolan will always kind of be yes, that sounds awesome. Let's do it. He's done that before with the Melo trade, obviously. Other situations where he's overextended. He's less involved than he used to be, but I think that's always kind of a concern. Another kind of situation in the Western Conference that I am kind of monitoring is honestly not with a team in the Western Conference or a player, but it is with Giannis. And I do think that, Giannis had some comments with the New York Times this weekend, and Bucks fans are understandably downplaying it, but it's important to kind of remember Like, I'm somebody that the first time this happened, I was like, guys, he's given no indication this is what he wants. He's said consistently he wants to stay in Milwaukee. They've built a really good team. They've done what they need to do with him. And he re-signed. We're in a bit of a different situation now. The championship core is aging out. Drew Holiday has said that he's going to retire after this next contract, after this current contract ends. Chris Middleton just signed this last deal. He's going to be an expensive plus 34-year-old. That's rough. Brooks really up there, and he's on a massive contract. One of the problems that those deals present is when you are trying to pivot in the event that a guy is not as good as he once was. Think Paul Millsap. Your margin for error is slim because you have a lot of money tied up. And if you can't move that because it's like, everyone's like, well, he's kind of old and, the peak is kind of gone, it gets harder to move them. And so I think that's pretty tough. Ted says 3 first-round picks for Drew killed the future for the Bucks. Maybe, but they won a title. Like, they won a title. It was worth it. Drew was the reason they won that title. So the cost is always high for these type of moves. I just think that you've always got to kind of make these moves in a very big way. Philly Urbanite says Embiid should not pick West over East. Yeah, the question of would Embiid go West, I think, is an interesting one. The other team I kind of want to mention here, I'll continue to say, I just have my eyes on the Lakers. You got to be able to extend this window because LeBron's probably going to leave, if not next year, then the year after. He's going to be gone. He's going to go. He's going to probably do his retirement year either with Bronny or in Cleveland. And if he's gone, can AD hold you up? Can a 33-year-old Anthony Davis hold you up, given what you've seen? Probably not. Probably not. And that gets into the question of all right, so what do you start doing? And maybe you start working on adding one of these next stars, whether it's Giannis or whether it's Embiid. What I will say is that the Nuggets, there's a lot of talk about the idea of this is the start of a dynasty for Denver. There's going to be more super teams. A lot of teams in the West are going to try and build organically. They're going to have really good superstars and really good teams and really good coaches. But a lot of teams are just going to try and add talent. It's what always happens. And they're just going to try and be like, well, we'll just get better players. And I don't know if that's going to be enough to beat Denver. That's what's really great about Denver is that they're so good at the other stuff. They may not need it. But I do think it's an interesting question to ask about what's going to be the next move in the Western Conference that we don't see coming. Dallas, obviously, I think is always going to be a question mark with Kyrie because Kyrie's always a question mark. I personally don't see the Luka stuff as real as others do. I just think they've got more time with Luka than people have presented his status as. I think he'll give them more years. He may leave, but I think he'll be more on the Giannis timeline than it will be on, a much shorter, I'm out of here kind of contract. So they're definitely a team to watch. And then finally, the other LA team, the Clippers. Paul George was actively involved in, they were including him in trade talks. I heard trade talks that were at least being discussed with them in July and late June. They were open to those discussions. Everything is on the table for the Clippers because they realize what a failure this has been. So I do, and I just think that realistically, you can't move Kawhi, one, because he's the best player and of how highly he's regarded, but also because I don't know that a lot of teams are they feel like they can take on the responsibility of him with both his injury status and unavailability. Could be the right spot for him. You don't want an unhappy Kawhi Leonard around. Not what you want. So I do kind of wonder if the Clippers are another team to make a big move as well. Keep an eye out because I do think there's a lot of changes that can happen between now and the trade deadline. I think the NBA is just going to get crazier, not more stable as the year goes on. On the other side, I want to talk a little bit about what the best and worst parts of covering a team like the Nuggets is. We'll do that on the other side when we return on Locked On Nuggets. Back here on Locked On Nuggets, thanks for joining us and making this part of your day. Appreciate you guys being with us on a Friday. Lots of folks hanging out in the chat segment. We got Steve Wynn, Philly Urbanite, Alexander Pavicevic is in here. Ted hanging out here, calling the Clippers a bust, as any good Nuggets fan would. Steve Wynn hanging out with us as well. Lots of folks in here with us on Friday. I want to talk a little bit about what the best and worst parts of covering a team is. So the best part is undeniably I've talked about this, about being in the media room and Brendan Vogt after one of their many very dominant wins this season, which is like, man, this team, man. Because when you do this for long enough, you do lose like a little bit of the newness and the appreciation and the novelty of, you get to go to NBA games. You shouldn't. I'll say that right now. You should never lose that, because these tickets cost fans so much. Like, I'm always aware of that when I'm in the building. When I try to mentor new writers, when new writers have been like, hey, I'm going to my first game, what do I do? I have like a list of things that I tell them. And one of the first things I say is, you have a right to be there by the granting of your credential, but you're also a guest in the house. And so that's important to kind of remember, is like, take your shoes off if you need to, don't get dirt on the rug. I should try and tell those things, because it really is a privilege. Like, I get to see the best athletes in the world. That's one of the things that's frustrating about some of the conversations I get into online about criticism. I try and be honest and transparent about criticism for whoever. And I could be biting and sarcastic at times, for sure. But I never, ever lose sight of the fact that these are the best athletes in the world. I get to cover the best athletes in the world. These are the best basketball players on the planet. And so much work goes into getting them there. And I see fractions and bits of that, and I'm always in awe of how much work goes into it and how difficult it is. Being in the building for moments like Game 5 of the finals it's an unbelievable experience. It's my favorite of all of the ones I've covered. That was my favorite, and not because I covered the team, but because I've talked about this, about how much hope was in that building, and it paid off. And you don't get to see that very often. I was in the building for, covering the nationally. I was in the building for Game 6 of Heat versus Spurs in 2013 with Ray Allen's shot. Like, I saw them getting out the tape for the celebration, and I saw that shot. I saw the Ray Allen shot. Being in the building for those moments is incredible. The thing is, like, I do get to understand and ask questions of these guys, and I'm grateful that they do make an attempt to answer the questions, and they do give a lot of their time when they don't want to us, to try and share those things. So having access to players, I think, is one of the things that I tell players pretty consistently is, like, I understand that time is your most valuable asset, because they have lots of money. They have lots of money, and they have lots of power, and they have lots of influence. But what they don't have a lot of is time, because they've got conditioning and training and treatment and shoot around and strength training and conditioning and treatment and games and post game and all these things. So anytime that the player gives to the media, I'm very appreciative of. And I do really appreciate getting to see the growth of players over time. Like, even though Nikola has become a lot more surly and downtrodden and bored, being able to say that, like, I've seen his evolution from the goofy kid to the suit wearing 2-time MVP NBA champion. It's very cool. To see Jamal from the brash kid that was just trying to find his way, who, was trying to learn from Jameer Nelson, to guy averaging 30 on 50, 40, 90 in the conference finals. It's wild. It's awesome. So you get to see all these types of things, and I'm always appreciative of those things. The worst thing, I think, to be quite honest, I think, is that it's difficult when you try and approach the job one way and you feel like you get lumped in with a lot of the criticism by the players and fans, honestly, with everybody else. So, one reason I think that Mike Singer is as successful as he is, Mike and I were having a discussion one time after a game, and he was like, well, I don't really think it's my place to have an opinion. He's more opinionated now than he used to be, because he's a lot more, like, he knows a lot more. But Mike was like, I cover the team. I say what happened. I report it, and he's really good at that side of it. My job as an analyst is a little bit different, and qualifications for any job, I think, are questionable. And you definitely question my qualifications on it. But what I do wind up seeing happening is, when players respond to questions, it's often the same. Like, I'm the same as Stephen A. Smith or Skip Bayless or a visiting news, or like a Plasty in LA, or a New York columnist, or an ESPN writer. Like, we're all the same. And it's not that I'm better or worse than those guys, because there's things that they're better at and things that I'm better at, and things I'm worse at and things that they're worse at. It's that I don't like the assumption that I would think of them the same way that other people do, right? And so I wish there was just a little bit more of an understanding of the media, quote unquote, is not a thing. We're not all looking to ask questions to create clickbait articles to get them in trouble. I think that there's value in asking tough questions. I think that's a really important part of it. It's honestly something I'm worried about going away with how much there's an abundance of positivity in a lot of the analysis that we see. It's just like all these good things. It's like you do have to ask the tough questions, because my thought has always been that we're the conduit between the fans and the game and the players and the teams. And so our job is like to ask the questions that they would want asked, to do it respectfully, which is why the notion that I get a lot of times is, why don't you hold these people accountable? That's not how this works. Like, you don't get to go in there and be like, Michael Malone, you screwed up this rotation. Like, they don't care what I think. Why would they? You know, I have a fraction of the information that they do, but you can ask, you can be like, what was the thought process behind making this decision making? And, you know, they'll tell you some form of the truth. So I think one of the things, Philly says, Matt, interaction with player with you might be their generic response, but I'm sure they know that you're different than Skip and Wrongs. I would say so, except that that's part of the problem is very few people are important. And I will say this, a good way to get better reactions from players is to build better relationships with them, which is a thing that I struggle with. Like, I struggle with that a lot because I'm so cognizant that their time is valuable that I don't take the time to build those relationships. And that's a weakness on my part. Like, nobody's good at everything. I'm funny sometimes, but could be better at building those relationships. I think that that's important. John Coleman says they'll never answer your questions again if you're confrontational. Depends on the tone, and depends on the history that you've built with them. You know, like, you can ask a tough question if you've been in the locker room and you're there every game and they know you, and then that you've earned that kind of respect. You know, I don't even know if that's me, but that's kind of part of it. Overall, there's nothing else in the world I would rather do than this job. Like, it's the best. And honestly, there are times when I wish I could cover the Nuggets more, because being this close to this particular franchise has been a real joy. I'm looking forward to watching what it looks like when they try and defend an NBA title, as they will do next month when training camp begins. Can you believe it? We're a month away from training. It is the 25th. We are a month away from training camp. Media day. It's wild. It's crazy. Not ready yet. That's got to do it for Locked On Nuggets for a Friday. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate you guys being with us. Make sure to check out Adam Mares and all of his great stuff over at DNVR. Hope you guys have a great weekend. Adam and I'll be back on Sunday night for World's Finest. You can check that out sometime between 9 and 10:30 Mountain Time is usually when we'll get started. When we know a definite time, I'll put it out on Twitter. You can follow the show on Twitter at Locked On Nuggets. Have yourselves a great weekend. We'll see you guys again next time on Locked On Nuggets.